one day they were having lots of stuff going on outside of their coaching context, but it meant that they were having a really rough day. And when they showed up to the field, they just talked to their players and said, you know what, today's been a really rough day for me. I find soccer to be a great outlet for how I can deal with it. Are you okay if I play a game with you? And then we'll get into practice. So if you think of that type of conversation, there's lots of things that we can take away from it. One is this idea of modeling our values and our behaviors, that by telling the athletes that they use soccer, that's how they address their what's going on in their life, and that soccer provides that outlet. They're actually modeling that healthy behavior of using soccer in that way. But they're also showing vulnerability. It's okay to not have a great day. And it's one of those things that when we're talking about sport and coaching, it's often easy to assume that everyone had a good day and is now ready to be their best selves in the sport environment. But that recognizing that we all have opportunities and times where we might need extra support. Another interesting piece is the idea of acknowledging areas or gaps of information. So if I'm sure all of you have experienced where an athlete asks a question and then you don't have the answer. So, the idea often where we say, I'm not sure, that's a really powerful statement of, I'm not sure, but I will find the answer. And in the best case, the idea of, why don't we look up the answer together, where you're actually showing your athletes, not only is it okay not to have the answer, but how you can go about finding the information if they needed it when you're not around. To help, again, share examples of what these principles look like in practice, I'm going to be sharing some quotes from participants who, again, when we asked them about this idea of how you build trust and respect, this was one of their responses. I'm comfortable saying to them, you know what, I screwed up, I'm sorry. And I'll say it to the whole practice, or I'll say it privately to them, depending on what's appropriate. But they know it's okay to screw up and it's okay not to do the right thing sometimes. So when we think about our coaching behaviors and what it means to build relationships, it's also really important to think about what they mean to other people. And this idea of showing vulnerability, humility, that it allows others to be vulnerable and to make mistakes as well. So again, thinking critically about what are your values and how are you modeling those to your athletes? And what does it tell them about how they behave in a sport environment and how leaders behave? So as you leave here today, this is a really important take-home point that I'd like you to think about in terms of what are you modeling to your athletes? So take a moment at the end of this to think about your behaviors and what do they say about your values? And is there alignment between your coaching behaviors and their values? And if there is, that's wonderful, but how can you build on that? And if there is a gap, how can we address that? So again, taking that time to think about what are we modeling to our athletes. The second dimension that we can think about is this idea of inspirational motivation. And this is, again, often about providing a picture of where we're going and how we'll get there. So one of the things we often do that is about discussing our goals and expectations. And to remember that when we're talking about coaching and relationships, to really adopt this person-centered approach where we think about goals and expectations both on and off the field of play. That we can have goals that are sport-related, but your athletes probably have lots of other goals that may not necessarily be about the technical or tactical aspects of sport. So thinking about a wide variety of goals and expectations that our athletes might have. Now, it's wonderful to have goals and think about where you want to be, but it's equally as important to show your athletes that you believe that they can reach, achieve, and even exceed those goals and expectations. So how do we actually show our athletes that we believe in their capabilities? So some ways people do that might actually be through setting challenging goals of, this is where I think you can go. Another important piece is paying attention to and drawing your athlete's attention to the work and the skills that they have. We can often see abilities in others that we can't see in ourselves. So recognizing an athlete who says, I know how hard you've been working on this. I think this is, what you can do or how you can actually apply all that work in your next competition. So really taking the time to show our athletes that we believe in what they're able to achieve. And I have athletes here, but you can also think about extending this beyond your athletes. So this might be expressing confidence in your staff, if you have, or your colleagues' capabilities, the parents on your team or your administrators. It could be also officials or fans, that we can think about showing others how we believe in them. Another important piece of the coaching is the idea of this collective vision. So it's not just about what each individual wants, their goals or expectations, but also what are we going to do together as a group? And one of the challenging aspects is actually applying that vision in everyday practice. So often we'll spend time as coaches thinking about what our mission statement is, or as a team, we might have a team cheer or a team identity, but what does that actually mean day to day? So this always reminds me of, how do we actually communicate our vision day to day? One of the ways we often do that is through the use of symbols and stories. So one time we were working with a coach who's a ski instructor, and what they had was actually a word. So in this case, it was race, and that every season they would think about, that key word and what does race mean to them. So it would be an acronym for what they're, who they were and how they behave. So R might be for respect, but, A might be for all out, that, they were going to give all their effort in everything that they did, both on and off the field of play. But thinking about that symbol, that they would actually have that, written on armbands and on a spot in their dressing room as a reminder of who they are. And that if the coach was noticing, something that either was in accordance, or that they would give feedback on athletes' behaviors and remind them of race. That was a great example of race, or, that wasn't our really in line with who we are. How can we actually go about changing that? So making sure that if you have a mission, how are you actually breathing life to it every day? So are there places in your environment where people can see it? Is it actually affecting your everyday behaviors? If it's not, thinking about what are the strategies that you can use to bring those missions to life. And the last one for this is this idea of providing meaning to tasks and roles. And this is all about understanding the why. So as leaders, it's not enough just to tell people, where we're going to go. We actually have to help them want to do it and understand why it's important. So how do we actually help people find meaning in what they do? And this is, again, I think that really challenging piece, that when we watched coaches' behaviors in practice, that this was a behavior we didn't see a lot of, where people would often tell and talk about their expectations and tell people they believed in them, but they wouldn't necessarily know why. Why is this important? How does this activity, this drill, relate to those goals and our vision? So anytime that you can offer an idea of why is this important? How is this going to help us be who we are? How is this going to help us achieve our goals? That really helps athletes understand the value of what they do. Again, just to give you an example of what this might look like in practice, for expressing confidence, one of our coaches had talked about this idea of, they just say it. They say it point blank. I believe in you, you're amazing. And that was spectacular, and never in a false way. That when you say it, there has to be a basis for it. And I really appreciated this quote, because they recognize that sometimes they believe in their athletes because of what they did in the sport, and some days because of who your heart is and what you're able to say to somebody else. So that idea is that we can express confidence in our athletes, not just in their sport skills, but in other skills. So that might be, how kind they are to others, how they were able to think of solutions outside the box, how they showed compassion to an opponent. Really thinking about, again, what are those capabilities and those skills that we want our athletes to develop? So again, as a question for all of you moving forward, is thinking about, in your next practice, how are you actually show and live your collective vision? If you have a mission statement, what will it actually look like? What will it sound like? What will it feel like to be in that environment? And how does it influence your day-to-day behaviors? The third one is intellectual stimulation. And this one really relates to this idea of trying to help people think differently, reevaluate their assumptions, and that this is a really important part of leadership. And that one way we can do that is often just by asking questions and getting people to reflect and rethink. One of the best ways I've heard of how we can actually go about do this is the word suppose. So asking an athlete, suppose I wasn't here today. What kinds of activities would you do for this practice? Suppose that your opponent had gone left instead of right. What might have happened? Using the word suppose as a way of helping people think about things differently. And really, this is, again, highlighting how important it is that we see coach behaviors as a relationship. That coaching isn't just to an athlete, it's with our athletes. And that coaches and athletes need to have these interactive conversations with each other to help people get better. There's some really interesting work looking at coaching outside of sport, actually in medical education contexts, of how they train residents to be doctors. And one of the things that they're moving towards is the idea that feedback is really a learning conversation, because it implies that both actors, both the coach and the athlete, have an integral role to play in shaping that conversation and how we can actually get better. Other ways we can engage in intellectual stimulation is by encouraging athletes to be creative and take risks. One of the wonderful things about sport is that it is a wonderful outlet for creativity and innovation. So we need to think about how are we providing our athletes with opportunities to actually take that initiative to be innovative, and how do we react when an athlete takes initiative? It's really easy to say that we value creativity when it turns out well in a game, but what if it doesn't work out? What kind of feedback are we giving? How are we reacting to our athletes when they do take those risks? Another important thing is that when we talk about transformational coaching, it really is about developing your athletes into future leaders. And if we want our athletes to become future leaders, then we need to provide them with opportunities to be leaders and practice being leaders. And ways that we can do that is by actually giving them opportunities. So this is where I'll say, we're often see examples of athletes leading warm-up, but your athletes can do so much more, that they can design all sorts of activities. They can design social events. They can design, events for, younger athletes in the club or for parents, but really providing them with opportunities to show their leadership skills and practice and get feedback on each other's leadership skills. It's also about making choices and decisions. So one of the challenging aspects of coaching is that we often have to give feedback with the idea that on game day, we're not actually the ones performing the skill, that it really is our athletes. So when we're on the sidelines watching, have we actually given them the tools to make decisions during a competition or during the game that can inform how they're going to compete? So again, practice making decisions is such an important part of successful coaching relationships. And again, these don't have to be open-ended. You can provide choices within a structure that you're comfortable with. So it doesn't necessarily need to be, what do you want to work on today? It could be, what would you like to work on, A, B, or C? And again, helping them understand what their choices might be. One thing, an example that I will use here is the idea of asking questions, not just when things go wrong, but also when things go right. So as an example, we had seen an athlete at a camp where they had done this amazing play, and the coach actually stopped to say, that was a great job. What were you paying attention to? What were you thinking about? And using a moment that had gone right to actually help that player figure out what was it about that moment that actually helped me perform that skill to my best. And then they actually brought in the rest of the team to let that athlete share what they had learned with everyone else. So again, thinking about how we can use these behaviors in everyday settings. So as an example, again, how do we actually engage our players? One coach had said, there's some things that you can miss. So ask them at the beginning of sessions, what do you do really well? What do you think you need to work on? And how do you feel about it? It's these types of questions that just by asking, now we have an opportunity to engage with our athletes, and we learn about them, because we learn what do they think their strengths are? What's informing that decision? What do they not know? Are you on the same page? Questions like this provide such an amazing opportunity to get to know our athletes and really involve them in their own development and in their own learning. So as a question, is just really to thinking about how would your athletes actually react to an opportunity to make decisions if they're not used to it it might be really difficult at first. So how can you actually embed these types of decision making so that people become more comfortable with the process of making decisions and being a leader? The last one that we'll talk about is this idea of individualized consideration. And this is really about showing interest in your athletes' lives in and out of sport. And that can involve such everyday behaviors as listening. It's amazing how much it can mean to someone to have someone listen. So if we are really bringing this together and to have someone that you trust and respect, spend time listening to your concerns, your needs. And it's also about listening and remembering previous interactions. So if someone's told you something, can you remember it and actually build that into your next piece? Another idea is recognizing athletes' contributions in and out of sport. That, again, athletes play such an important role in our sport environments. And are we actually recognizing their contributions? So this is where an opportunity exists where to think about, as coaches, how many of you might have received a thank you card from someone over the years, and how many of you probably have kept that thank you card. And what that thank you often means to us is that the work that we do means something to someone else. So if that kind of memento is so important to us, how are we actually thanking our athletes? How are we recognizing their contributions? So do we recognize contributions that are just on the field of play, or do we recognize that player who comes early or who stays late and helps us pick up the cones and the equipment, the athlete who's doing really well at school, the athlete who helps out with their family or with their broader community? So thinking about what accomplishments you actually recognize. And one of the really challenging pieces of individualized consideration is making sure that we actually do it with all of our athletes, not just a select few. So one strategy that coach had used, because it's challenging to make time to do this, one strategy one coach had used was actually having a picture of their team, and each time they had a meaningful interaction with their athletes, they'd actually put a sticker on the face of the photo so that they could make sure that by the end of the week they had had a meaningful interaction with everyone on the team. But it also let them keep track of consistently it was these players who were receiving attention, and consistently it wasn't these players. And other things to keep in mind, that it doesn't have to all be on your shoulders. So how can you engage your staff or your athlete leaders to help you get to know and check in with everyone, where you each might have 3 people that you're going to check in with each day, and then by the end of the week we all get to know each other a little bit better. So again, when we asked coaches, how do you do this? One of them had said, I try and see each person individually, speak to each of them meaningful during practice, and try to have a relationship that each of those children need. And again, thinking about the importance of that moment of that how are you, or that thank you, these really mean a lot to people. And how can we actually embed this in our coaching practice? So this is the question I'd like to challenge you all with today is about thinking about when to use these behaviors. So, the beginning of practice might be a good check-in point, but also it can be during a practice. So one of the coaches, they had recognized that during the warm-up, they had an opportunity where they could actually, if they weren't staying on the sidelines, they could actually, this was a hockey one, where they could actually skate around and check in with each of the players. How was school? How's your brother doing? These kinds of moments are really important. And I'd just like to share another example, again, of thinking about why these behaviors are so important. And an example that might be really relevant during this time, we actually had an opportunity to talk to an emergency room doctor about leadership behaviors. And they were saying that when a child comes into the emergency room, how you have such little time to make an interpersonal connection, but how it's so important to the care of the patient. So they were talking about, if you think of the emergency room when a child comes in, that's an incredibly stressful situation. And that it'd be really tempting to immediately go to what's wrong and how can I address it? But sometimes there was also a moment of, checking, just even using the patient's name. Hi, Alex, how are you? Can you, those are amazing shoes. Is that your favorite color? taking those moments to notice something about that individual. And what they said is by doing that, you could actually see a change in that situation where, you know, from the patient that they felt seen and valued, that the parents also relax. And I think it's such a powerful example of taking that moment to recognize the people that we're working with, and that while we want to get better at our sports skills, that we're doing that in the context of a relationship. So how can we get to have those connections with each other to make us all a little bit better? So as I mentioned, one of the things about learning about all those different types of behaviors was that we also wanted to know what behaviors as coaches do we need to work on? Are we using all those 11 behaviors? Are there ones that we're not using? So this is where we did a bit more research to figure out how are these behaviors actually being applied in practice. So as I said, we had an observational tool, and now we're actually going to use it to assess coaches' behaviors. So in this study, we actually had 21 hockey coaches and 291 athletes. And what we did, again, is we had a camera and a microphone, and we watched 2 practice sessions for each coach to total about 45 minutes of videos. We also had the athletes fill out questionnaires about their motivational outcomes. And then we coded. So we had 3 15-minute clips where we would code every second of their behaviors to see what kinds of leadership behaviors they were using. And we also kept track of, were they using those leadership behaviors when they were providing instruction? Was it when they were having conversations about unrelated to sport? And also, who was the recipient of these behaviors? So was it to individuals or to the whole team? And then we ran some analysis to figure out what behaviors were they using the most and the least, and what impact that has on athlete development. And what we saw, so one of the interesting things was the amount of time that coaches spent silently observing their athletes. And I want to raise this point because I think it's such an important piece of coaching, where an important coaching behavior is sometimes saying nothing. And that observation is a really powerful tool that coaches have to actually inform their behaviors. And that observation is an opportunity to, see how athletes are doing, what skills they're working on, how it's being executed, but also paying attention to things such as, which athletes are, really taking on that leadership role, who's interacting with who on the team. Are there opportunities for, conflict or communication, of ways of improving communication between the players? So the observation is such a powerful coaching behavior that we have. And it's okay that it spends quite a bit of our time. And then on average, coaches spend about 24 minutes interacting with their athletes. So then we had to figure out, during those 24 minutes, what types of leadership behaviors were they using? And what we found was this dominance of neutral behaviors. So I mentioned it quickly previously, but neutral really refers to behaviors that don't have a clear leadership tone. So really, these are more passive or are vague in nature, where it might be things like head up or good job, go over here. So they're important behaviors, but there might also be an opportunity to do similar behaviors and tweak them a little bit to be more transformational in nature. So rather than a good job, it could be great job, Hayden. I really appreciated how you took that corner. Or, instead of, go over here, where do you think you should be? So by making these small tweaks in our behaviors, you can take something from neutral and make it more transformational. Another interesting piece was that coaches were using some transformational behaviors, but that there probably was some opportunities for improvement. And we did see from all our coaches that they used a combination of neutral, transactional, and transformational. So it's not that anyone's 100% transformational, but it's really a question of how do you balance these different behaviors. From the data, what we saw were pretty low levels of laissez-faire and toxic behaviors, but almost about half of the sample did have instances of using them. So one of the questions we also have to think about as coaches is, are we using laissez-faire or toxic behaviors? And again, what might lead us to using them, and how can we improve in the future? So, might there be certain factors that we're under, or situations where we're more likely to use those behaviors, and how can we address them in the future? So when we talk about the 4 transformational leadership dimensions and those coaching behaviors that are associated with them. We wanted to see which ones coaches were using the most. And in general, what we saw was that coaches were really good at using inspirational motivation, in particular, the idea of discussing goals and expectations. That coaches spent a lot of time talking with their athletes, what was expected of them and how they were going to achieve these goals. But we also saw lots of areas for improvement. So on average, for the 45 minutes, we saw an average of coaches using idealized influence and intellectual stimulation only about 30 seconds each. So thinking about, are there opportunities where we can improve our use of these behaviors? I think in particular for intellectual stimulation, this is really about involving your athletes in the coaching process, giving opportunities for their input to share decision-making, but also providing feedback that's more effort rather than outcome focused. So thinking critically about our behaviors and, other opportunities to use that in different ways. We also saw individualized consideration. And again, one of the things that we were interested in was, this was really impactful, but also are there ways to improve these behaviors? And so I see a hand for questions, and I think we'll do them at the end if that's okay. One of the things that we can take from all this data was, there was this idea of there's a prevalence of neutral coaching and that there's an opportunity to enhance the quantity and quality of our behaviors, and that we also need to explore ways of how we can change our leadership behaviors. So this is what led us to that question of what needs to change. So what we needed to actually look at were, what are those factors that influence our behaviors? And we can think about things such as our capability. So do we actually have the knowledge and skills to use these behaviors? Our motivation, do we want to use these leadership behaviors? And opportunity. So this could be opportunity in terms of time or resources or equipment, but it could also be opportunity in terms of social support. So are there people around us who value the use of the behaviors? Or does our organization evaluate us on using the behaviors? All these different factors might influence whether or not we use these behaviors. So this is where we actually did some more research to interview coaches to understand what are their key barriers that influence coaches' leadership behaviors and what would be relevant for helping them change their behaviors. And what coaches tended to tell us is that they felt that they were pretty capable of using these behaviors, that, that they had the knowledge and skills to be able to, some share decision-making with their athletes, to show interest in their lives, but they needed help to enhance the quality of those behaviors. That they were motivated, that they did see the value in them, but we also need to think about, what are the outcomes that are associated with these behaviors. So if we want to help people use these behaviors more, that we need to do a better job of showing the link between these behaviors and athlete outcomes. And that's really where, if you are interested in this, there is a large body of research showing how these behaviors can affect athlete development at sort of the individual level of how they, how competent they are, how confident they feel about themselves, at the relationship level, and improves the relationship quality between athletes and coaches and with their team, but also at the environment, that it creates a more inclusive environment, that people feel better supported, and that these findings also exist beyond sport, so that we can draw on data not just in sport but from other contexts as well. And then the last one was this idea of opportunity, and coaches really emphasized the need, how opportunity was a key issue, and we need to spend some time thinking about how we can actually integrate these behaviors and make time for these behaviors in our practices. So this is where the next steps for the journey is about, how do we actually take all this information and apply it in everyday settings? So this is where we're going to spend a little bit of time thinking about behavior change techniques. So the information that I've given you today, what are some things that we can do to think about how we can apply this to our own behaviors? The first piece is really about this idea of self-reflection. And do we take time to actually reflect and re-examine our own leadership behaviors? So these can be things such as, there are tools that exist out there as far as questionnaires or just questions to ask yourself. One might be about things like, do you think you have the knowledge and understanding to use behaviors? Do you have the necessary resources, or do you want to use these different behaviors? So this sample one just has them all as a whole, but you could think of each of those 11 behaviors and think about, do I want to do this? Or maybe I feel like I don't have enough time, or no one else in my organization uses it, so why would I? But thinking about your behaviors, and thinking about your behaviors overall, but also thinking about these behaviors in all of your different types of interactions. So you might use a lot of transformational behaviors with your athletes, but maybe you're not being particularly transformational when you interact with the officials. So really thinking about reflecting on our behaviors is a really important point in terms of how we can actually reflect and then change our behaviors. Again, thinking about what are those barriers to using the behaviors, and what strategies can we use to overcoming these behaviors. It might be simple things like if you don't have time to organize the practice, maybe you're less likely to use individualized consideration, because rather than having conversations with each of your athletes, you're setting up all the equipment, or you're still trying to actually plan the practice. So some of those important conversations may not be happening. And also, what are some ways to actually overcome these barriers? It's really nice to think that all these behaviors naturally occur, and some of them might happen day to day, but if we spend the time to actually plan on using them and set goals for using, we're much more likely to use them. So I would challenge all of you that if you have a practice planning template, to think about adding a column to think about your leadership behaviors. If you're going to be doing a particular activity, so if you're doing a guided discovery block, how can you actually embed opportunities to share decision making with your athletes during that time? If you're going to, be doing, an end of session check-in, how can that actually reflect on your vision as a team and who you are? And again, thinking about setting goals for our leadership behaviors. So how can we change our behaviors, and thinking about the smallest everyday behavior. So whether that's maybe, rather than saying giving feedback to the whole team, giving a feedback to individual athletes, maybe it's about when you provide feedback, explaining why you notice that. These small behaviors can have a big impact on our athletes. In terms of prompts and cues, thinking about things that you can change in your environment that might help you be more likely to use these behaviors. These might be cue cards, or, like I said, visual symbols, reminders to think about what are things that might remind me of the importance of these behaviors and to use them day to day. So it could be, a daily check-in to check in with each of your athletes. And again, using these types of planning evaluation tools to help us use these behaviors. So as previously I mentioned, the idea of using these types of questionnaires to reflect on your own behaviors, you can also use those questionnaires and give them to other people to see how others are seeing you. So how do your athletes see you? How do parents see you? How do your colleagues or administrators see your behaviors? And that might help you give some insight into what behaviors you're using and what behaviors you could use more. And the idea of social support, and this is really important because it did come out in a lot of our data, is that it's not enough to try and do this on your own. That when we're talking about transformational coaching, where it's not an individual issue, it's really about changing our system to be some more supportive of interpersonal knowledge behaviors and becoming better coaches altogether. To define examples of people using these behaviors in action, we'll give you a warning that once you start to look for these behaviors, you'll start to see them everywhere, and you'll see them in and out of sport. To talk to each other about our leadership behaviors. We often talk to each other about the X's and O's of sport, but are we spending time talking to our colleagues, reflecting on our interpersonal behaviors? What works, what doesn't work? What strategies do other people use? What other barriers are people experiencing? And sharing stories of these behaviors and actions, and actually holding each other accountable for our behaviors. So as we're leaving here today, just some reminders for your journey of transformation, as well as some take-home points from my own journey itself, that at the end of the day, transformational coaching behaviors show others that they are important, and that they are important just for being who they are. Their unique strengths, their unique needs, that they as individuals are important. Another piece is what they do is important, and that what they do might be a task, it might be an activity in a practice, it might be a role they have on the team, it might be someone who is not a starting player, is on the bench, but that what they do is important, but also that what they do outside of sport is important. What their interests are, that their school, their family, their other sports or other interests, those are important too. And if you remember nothing else from this talk, that use these as your filters for your coaching behaviors. Is the behavior that I'm about to do, is it going to show an athlete that they are important and what they do is important? And if your answer is yes, that's probably a good behavior to use. But again, keeping in mind this idea of showing others that they are important and what they do is important. And to keep in mind that small everyday behaviors can lead to transformational change. It's in these everyday moments that we might take for granted that's really where we're seeing these important connections being made in sport. And coaches play such an important role in our sport environments. So remembering that our everyday behaviors can play such an important role in athlete development. And thank you very much for your time. And a huge thank you to the work that you do as coaches. I think that's what we've learned time and time again from our data, is that coaches can have such an important influence on athlete development. So to thank you for the work that you do, and to thank you for coming today. I really appreciate it. So if you have questions, there's some time now, but also please feel free to follow up and email me as well.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I am going to jump right into a couple questions because we have a few minutes. So Mike, you have your hand up. Do you want to unmute, or can you? Mike, do you want to go ahead with your question? And anyone else that has questions, you can throw them in the chat now and I'll share them with Jennifer. And we do have 2 that people already provided. Mike Hudson, your hand is up. Do you have a question? We can't hear you yet. Okay, we'll jump to the other questions and then we can come back. So Jennifer, you have 2 here. So I'll go to the first one. Are there major differences between male and female coaches?
So one of those things I will say, within sport, there's still more data that we can use. One of the things that I think is interesting about leadership behaviors is that, it's one of those things where some of the data from outside sport has actually shown that female leaders might use some of these behaviors more. So that's an interesting thing to look at, and certainly a question that we can keep asking moving forward. And I think that's one of the pieces here where, these are behaviors that might have, again, that our gender or experiences might influence them, but that we're all capable of using them and using them most effectively that work best for us. So it's a great question. And there, if you are interested in that, there is some research that we can point you towards.
Awesome. Okay, and then another question. How do competing studies impact implementation of research? At this year's concussion symposium, it showed physical gender differences for concussion, symptoms, and recovery. Shortly after that, Cirque shared a study that says gender differences in symptoms and recovery time were solely due to female athletes not reporting concussions as quickly as male athletes. So then back, Jennifer, how do competing studies impact implementation of research?
So it's a really important question, I think, in terms of, how do we use research to inform our decisions? And I'm sure everyone has experienced this over the past year, where you see that research is constantly evolving. So what we're trying to do with research is, answer questions to the best that we can, but being really aware of when you're reading research to keep in mind things such as, how did they collect the data? Who did they collect the data with? It's one of those things where, if we look at coaching research, that often we were looking at, it could be male coaches, or it could be that we were only looking at able-bodied sport context. So there might be voices who aren't represented in the data that exists right now. So being critical and thinking about whose who's being represented in that study, who's not. A great thing is also look at for a synthesis. So rather than at each individual article, you'll often find literature reviews. So sometimes they call them a systematic review or a meta-analysis, where it's actually bringing lots and lots of studies together. That helps you make sense of that. And that can be one way of having, a bit more confidence in the data that you're looking at. There's actually some really interesting papers for coaches as well, where they've actually graded the research evidence to, again, help make sense of where the data is at and where do we need more. So those are some different things to look at, is, and also know that researchers love to talk about their research. So if you have questions, if there's a way of reaching out to researchers who are around you, who might know the answer, who might be able to point you in the direction, or it could even be, an author of the study to say, I'm really interested, can you tell me more about this? So really engaging with researchers as well is one way to help make sense of those.
Thank you, Jennifer.